Thank you very much. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I am incredibly lucky to be among the people who are here. Tobacco is an absolutely crucial, if not the most crucial health problem that we're facing globally, and the efforts against it actually require the heroic efforts of all of the individuals gathered here and all of the individuals who are actually concerned with the fight. And the actual reductions in smoking really come about by that granular effort of individual people to stop smoking, but also all the efforts of the people who work against tobacco. Centuries ago, Voltaire said that those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And I think that this is a central tenet of what we're facing here, because to me it is completely absurd that 1 in 6 deaths internationally at the moment are attributable to tobacco. And we consider that it is appropriate that the rights of companies to profit are more important than people's ability to live a long and healthy life. That's absurd. And if we think about how much value we would place on 6 million deaths a year and the outrage we have at events that have caused 6 million deaths in the past, we have kind of accepted at some level the absurdity of that. And hence we have the atrocity of the 6 million deaths a year. So I think that I'm in the room of people who don't believe that absurdity and who consider that atrocity something that we have to fight hard against. So I am lucky to be with you, and I'm lucky to be here with this sense of shared purpose. I'm here to present data on smoking and mortality, and particularly the first large-scale Australian results. And it's particularly nice to be presenting this here because Australia has been a world leader in tobacco control despite actually not having direct data from Australia about smoking and mortality. So when I tell people that I work on tobacco, you often get this sort of reaction, which is, well, why would anybody do that? In fact, it's almost impossible to get any sort of research grant money on this particular thing because people say, well, it says it on the packet. Why are you researching that? And it's absolutely true that it's well established that smoking is bad for your health, and it's well established that smoking increases your risk of dying prematurely. But one of the things that people don't realise, I think, is that the magnitude of that effect matters. It matters for public health, and it matters for people's perceptions of risk, and it matters for our overall understanding of the impact of smoking. We know that the impact of smoking on death rates overall varies by time and population. And according to where the country is in the tobacco epidemic, as Alan has so beautifully pointed out. The other thing we know is that it is very, very important to have local evidence. So we know internationally, we've got a lot of data that smoking is bad for your health, but there's something about the power of having information from your own community for your own policies. And the other thing is that because of Australia's exemplary record in tobacco control, we actually are able to make an international contribution by looking at smoking and mortality because it's a unique context. I just got some examples there of how it says it on the packet and the different way it says it in different countries. So the Marlboro one is there from the US, and it says in gold writing on a white background, cigarette smoke contains carbon monoxide. Now, I think most of us would know that the air we breathe contains carbon monoxide, so I wouldn't see that as the strongest health warning ever. But you can see the Australian packet there with someone who's actually just very recently died from smoking on the front, and very profound images there. So these are the stages of the cigarette epidemic which Alan has outlined, and really looking across those stages you can see that different countries are in the different stages, and countries such as China and various parts of Southeast Asia that are at a stage of quite rapid increase or very high rates, high prevalence. Australia is really classed as in the stage 4 of that epidemic, in that smoking rates are coming down and some of the death rates are coming down. So it's actually an important part of the epidemic to have an understanding of. I think one of the sad things about this graph is that it kind of assumes an inexorable progression through those stages, whereas in fact it's completely unnecessary for countries to go through each of these stages. We know exactly, we know what smoking does, we know it's bad, and I think it's useful to phrase it this way, but also to say we can avert a lot of this. Australia has a very low prevalence of smoking, but is surrounded by a lot of countries with quite high prevalences. And I think that one thing that Australia, New Zealand and Oceania can be very proud of is that effective tobacco control is one of our great exports. You know, we really can show that it is possible to reduce smoking from very high rates. And this is some of the findings that were in our paper, which is really collated from work that's gone on over time, just documenting the prevalence of smoking in Australia. You can see from this graph, which starts in 1933 and goes to 2013, and it's actually the prevalence of daily smoking in adults. And the men are the top line, women are the bottom line. I've got some dotted lines up to the sort of late 1970s because the data were a little less reliable there. But what you can see is that we went from the majority of men smoking down to really around an overall prevalence of smoking of 13%, or 12.8% in the latest assessments. You can see that women, their smoking rates peaked lower, but they peaked in the late 1970s. Their rates have dropped considerably. But we do still assess that there are around 2.7 million smokers in Australia. So although we pride ourselves on having very low rates of smoking, it's still a very large number of people. And it's also increasingly concentrated among the disadvantaged and the mentally ill. But at the same time, this is the bright side, whatever we're doing right is outweighing what we're doing wrong. These show some death rates in 5 different countries in the age group 35 to 69, which is the sentinel age group. It's the age group we look at for premature mortality, and it's more sensitive than overall life expectancy to look at that. This is a number of different countries, and it's from work by the late Gary Whitlock from his mortality trends work. You can see that Australian men overtook Japan in terms of mortality rates in the late 1990s. And in fact, there's only one country doing better than Australia internationally for overall death rates in this age group, and that's Iceland. So most Australians don't know that. And you'll notice in the dialogue in the introduction here, people knew a lot about sport. And I have an image that you could go down the pub and people go, oh, check out the latest death rates. I know. The Japs had it on us until the late 1990s, but then we overtook them. What do you reckon it is? Oh, well, it's probably smoking, but I reckon better control of blood pressure, wouldn't you say? Yeah, but statins have played a part as well. And what about the plain packaging? Because I know this sounds a bit ridiculous, but one of the problems we have, and Terry alluded to this sort of concerns about statins, is that because people are unaware of how well we've been doing, they're quite vulnerable to misinformation. But if we were able to say, look, we've won the Ashes every single year since 1968, then if someone came along and said, well, we really need to change the coach, and the fielding's terrible, and what about the batting? Right? We'd be immune to those messages because we would know that we've been doing incredibly well. So I think it's actually time for a bit more health literacy. I don't know if we need like a health Olympics or something. But I think it's really important that people understand just how well we've done. Our cardiovascular death rates have dropped by 80%. That's 80%. So we have around 45,000 deaths a year from cardiovascular disease. We would have around 200,000 deaths a year if we'd continued at peak rates in 1968. So we've got this massive triumph. It's not entirely understood, but tobacco control has played an absolutely critical role. So on the back of that positive news, I'll talk about the specific findings that I'm presenting today. So the aim of this study was to investigate the relationship of smoking to all-cause mortality in Australia using a study called the 45 and Up study. The 45 and Up study is a study of a bit over 250,000 people who were recruited into a study from 2006 to 2009 from the state of New South Wales in Australia. And it's indicated there on the map. And the bottom map shows each of the participants geocoded, the first 100,000 geocoded onto the map. So they're half urban and half rural, and they're concentrated in the main population centres. We had around an 18% response rate. They were sampled from the general population. Now, I should note that the response rate is not germane to the ability to compare smokers and non-smokers. So if you think about the British doctors study, it didn't matter that British doctors were not representative of the general population for us to be able to compare smokers and non-smokers. You wouldn't necessarily use something with an 18% response rate to assess prevalence, but it's valid for internal comparisons. People completed a baseline questionnaire and gave consent for long-term follow-up, including linkage to health data and death data. So the methods we used were those of a cohort study. We looked at 45 and up participants. We excluded those with missing data on smoking, and we also excluded those who had illness at baseline, those who had self-reported cancer, apart from melanoma and non-melanoma skin cancer, or those who had heart disease or stroke at baseline. And that was to avoid a thing called the sick quitter effect, where people quit smoking because they're ill, and so you end up with underestimates of risk. We followed participants up for deaths using the Register of Births, Deaths and Marriages to mid-2012. So this is our baseline questionnaire ascertainment. It's a question that was drawn from the Million Women study worked on with Richard Peto and colleagues. It's, have you ever been a regular smoker? How old were you when you started smoking regularly? Are you a regular smoker now? And if no, when did you quit? And the number of cigarettes per day. So it's a fairly standard question. It's much shorter than a lot of the other questions that sort of ask, have you ever smoked at least 100 cigarettes a day? There's a lot of other questions you can ask. But we only had one extended piece of A3 paper for all of the questions to be asked on the 45 and up study, so we had to be brief. This is a schematic of how we did it. The baseline survey data were collected from 2006 to 2009. We then have the linked death data up to 2012. We also had linked data on hospitalisations going backwards, and that allowed us to do a sensitivity analysis where we also excluded people with admissions for respiratory disease prior to baseline. We used a Cox proportional hazards model with age as the underlying time variable and adjusted for a number of factors considered to potentially confound the relationship of smoking to death rates. We looked at survival. We looked at men and women separately, and we also looked according to year of birth because we were interested in seeing whether we had a mature epidemic of smoking. And we also wanted to see whether the risks of smoking had actually was stable, whether they'd essentially been realised. And as I said, we did sensitivity analyses, particularly looking at different definitions of current smoking and looking at excluding people with previous respiratory disease. So these are the results. We had around a bit over 200,000 participants once we'd excluded those people, and we ended up with 874,000 person years over a mean follow-up of around 4.3 years. There were around 5,600 deaths. And this is a graph showing current smokers, former smokers and never smokers. And what we found in our study was that around 8%, between 7 and 8% of the people in the cohort were current smokers. Now that reflects the fact that smoking rates are actually very low in Australia now, and in fact in the same age group in New South Wales the smoking rate was around 12%. But the other thing is that people who join cohort studies tend to be healthier than those who don't join cohort studies, so you tend to have around a 30% lower smoking prevalence in any cohort study. In fact, if you join a cohort study, your mortality risk overall is halved generally, so it's a really good thing to do for your health. If you want to do something good for your health. Yeah. And in fact, the other thing is whenever I talk about this, because it's around 10% of the New South Wales population is in this study, I often find there are people in the audience who are taking part, so I like to take an opportunity to also thank all the people who participate in research, because we wouldn't have any of this without people participating. But anyway, very low overall smoking rates, and that's another reason why these data are really important internationally, because we're talking about the risks in a country which has very low prevalence and a long-standing epidemic. So these are the hazard ratios. What I can say is that the relative risk of death in current versus never smokers in the men was 2.82, and in the women it was 3.08. In fact, there was no significant difference between men and women there. So it's around a tripling in the risk of dying during the follow-up period. And that's with all those adjustments. Former smokers, a 30 to 50% increase in risk. This is it according to year of birth below that. And the main thing to note is that the patterns are similar according to the year of birth. So it suggests that we've got an established epidemic and we've got an established pattern of risk. In terms of age standardised rates of all-cause mortality, looking at smoking intensity, those who smoked a mean of 10 cigarettes a day and those, as Alan pointed out, who were generally classed themselves as light smokers actually had a twofold increase in the risk of dying. And that's equivalent risk of increased mortality of being morbidly obese, so having a BMI of 35 or more, or drinking a bottle of vodka a day. But most people who smoke 10 cigarettes, or on average a day, 5, this was below 14, so some of those would be smoking 5 cigarettes a day, they generally wouldn't think of themselves in that category of risk. Once you get to people who are smoking 25 or more cigarettes a day, it's around a 4 to 5-fold increase in risk. So that means that around 75 to 80% of the people in that group are likely to die of smoking-related diseases. Good news is that if you stop smoking, your risk goes quite rapidly back to that of a never smoker. So those who quit smoking by the age of 45 actually had no significant increase in the risk of mortality compared to never smokers, and those who quit between 45 and 55 still had a much lower risk compared to those who continued to smoke. This is those estimates then applied to a hypothetical population to look at the life expectancy differences. And what you can see is that among smokers, around 45% had died by the age of 75, compared to 19% of male smokers. And you can see a similar sort of patterns in the women, around a 10-year loss of life expectancy overall. We didn't have data on cause of death, and we are going to analyse that subsequently. But we do know that that elevated risk of death in the smokers is likely to be causal for the large part. So in conclusion, from the Australian data, we found a low prevalence of smoking, but the risk of dying during follow-up was around threefold. And that means that up to 2/3 of deaths in smokers are attributable to smoking, meaning that around 1.8 million of the 2.7 million current smokers in Australia could be expected to die from their habits. This is a greater risk than people had previously thought. And so with that increased hazard that we've identified, we also know that the benefits of quitting are greater than previously thought. But the earlier the better, and around a 10-year estimated average reduction in life expectancy. I wanted to do a comparison with international data. And one of the things that we do see over time is an evolution of risks. If you look at the British doctors study and you look at the ratio of rates on the right-hand side of this graph, in the 1950s, the relative risk of mortality in smokers compared to non-smokers was around 1.2, meaning around 1 in 6 smokers would die from their habit. In the 1980s, it was around twofold, which meant that around 50% of smokers would die from their habit. And when we get into the latter part of the 20th century, early part of the 21st century, around a threefold increase in risk. So when we then compare our contemporary findings with findings from other countries with a similar epidemic structure, and that's the Richard Dole finding of 2.83 for men, we actually had 2.82. So you can imagine a lot of people get excited about a discovery where they've discovered something completely different from everybody else. I have to say I had shivers going down my spine when I had our findings that were aligned so perfectly with international data. And you can see that for the women they also aligned. So this is really the mounting evidence that when you get to the high levels of smoking, where the smokers have been smoking for a very long period of time and they've been smoking intensively, smokers will have very high risks of death. Similar estimates of reductions in life expectancy of around 10 years. So this is the evolution in risks, and I'm waiting for Simon Chapman to help me with some sort of slogan here. But in the 1960s, smoking was like tossing a dice. Around 1 in 6 smokers would die from their habit. In the 1980s, it was like tossing a coin. And now, I think it might be time to stop gambling. So, what does it matter that we've moved from thinking that smoking kills a half of all smokers to 2/3? Well, this is something about the balance of probabilities. It matters a lot, I think, when you say, well, you've got a 50-50 chance. It actually has a different meaning to saying, well, the chances are it's going to get you. And we know that a lot from, say, civil law and other things. But it also means that if one person quits, the chances are you've actually saved a life. So it does matter, and although it says it on the packet, these details do matter. So I'd like to just note that these findings have received quite a bit of media attention, but they've also had quite a lot of policy impact already. And the day after the findings came out, ACOSH put out an ad, a full-page ad in the Western Australian about it. And we also had quite close policy liaison to make sure that the impact was maximised. The other thing is that this is just one example of how it's being used, that Bronwyn King, who's a radiation oncologist, who's actually convinced 28 super funds to divest at least $1.3 billion from smoking, from tobacco companies, has said that these data are particularly important for her. I think it just shows the value of local data. So I'd like to conclude by thanking my co-authors. It also includes Alan Lopez, who's here, all the participants in the study, people I would call the usual suspects in terms of tobacco control, so Mike Daub, Simon Chapman, Rob Moody, Michael Moore, and the people who've supported me, and particularly my university, because this kind of work doesn't get you funding from competitive grant agencies. It's really important to have support from your organisation. This is a picture from my university, and the clarity of the air here, I think you'd note. Australian National University just went smoke-free, and I think you can see it in the air. Thank you.